And oh, there we go. Recording started. So I also want to introduce Voicemail for those of you who may not be familiar. So Voicemail is the longest running pro-feminist men's magazine in North America. Next Gen Men recently became the new publishers of Voicemail magazine and is dedicated to continuing its legacy in exploring masculinity, gender justice, and social change through stories of hope, healing, and collective action. This event is part of Voicemail Talks, an event series by Next Gen Men designed to amplify the conversations sparked by Voicemail magazine. Voicemail Talks brings together experts, advocates, and allies around Voicemail's core mission of promoting positive masculinity, mental health, and fostering discussions on how we can create a more just and inclusive world for everyone. So, here is what we'll cover in our conversation today. We'll start by introducing our panelists. Then we'll hear from Dr. John Oliffe about why this conversation is so important, drawing on hot off the press research. Then we'll move to the practical part, learning from Trevor Mayo and Casey Robinson about how we can actively work to support men's mental health at work. And finally, we'll aim to leave around 15 minutes for you to ask your questions at the end. So feel free to submit your questions to the Q&A box throughout, and we'll get to as many of them as we can at the end. The Q&A box is located at the bottom of your screen on the Zoom control bar. And just a quick housekeeping note, you would have heard it there, but the session is being recorded and we'll be sending out the recording afterwards, along with a few resources and contact information for our panelists. Awesome. So now to introduce our panelists, and Casey, will come to you first. So tell us a bit about yourself and your work in this space.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to say morning, afternoon, and evening, because that's quite literally all the time zones that we've managed to capture here. So thank you all for coming, and thank you to those of you who are joining afterwards. My name is Casey Robinson, as Charlotte kindly said. My role is Head of Workplaces at a UK-based charity called Beyond Equality. So we're sort of basically like the UK version of Next Gen Men, and we work together collaboratively in lots of different ways. But my role is to head up our Workplaces program and to bring these types of conversations, workshops, and training into as many corporate spaces as possible. Thanks, Charlotte. Oh, you're on mute, Charlotte. Charlotte, you're on mute.
Thank you. God, do you think I'd get a hand of this by now?
A classic 2020, that one. You know, we're in 2025 now. Come on, get it back.
Good times. All right. Thanks, Casey. Trev, over to you. Tell us a bit about yourself and your work in this space.
Thanks, Charlotte. My name's Trevor Mayo, he, him. I'm dialing in from the GTA. I actually work with Charlotte, a colleague of mine. I'm the principal consultant with Equity Leaders, which is a social enterprise of Next Gen Men. It works in male-dominant spaces, essentially engaging men on what their role is in the equity journey. And we spend a lot of time talking about mental health as an entry point for help people to understand that. So,
awesome. Thanks so much, Trev. And last but certainly not least, John, over to you. Tell us a little bit about yourself and your work in space.
Yeah, hi. I'm phoning in from Vancouver today, and yeah, I do men's health research, run the men's health research program at UBC, and have a research chair which allows me to focus on research for all things men's health.
Awesome. Thanks so much, John. To start us off, we're sticking with John, who's going to draw on his research to lay the foundation for our chat today. So John, feel free to take over the screen share. I'll stop mine and tell us why this topic, supporting men's mental health, is so important.
Yeah, I'm really keen to hear from Casey and Trevor. So I'll just try to preface some of the report that we've produced, just to say this is the first time we've done an actual report about men's health in Canada. Long overdue. We follow the Australian report and also the UK report, and we're preceding reports that will come from New Zealand, the US, and also Ireland. It's a detailed report. Obviously, I can't talk to all of it today. I encourage you to download it. It's freely available. It's quite long, but it's got some really good moments in it around empirical data. I'll give you a few high-level points that might help us sort of frame the discussion for today. You know, the most often told story of men's health is that men don't live as long as women. I think it's true in many situations, in many countries, but I think it's probably, we can be a little bit more nuanced in how we talk about men's health. If you think about the causes of that 4.5-year loss in order: their cancers, coronary heart disease, accidents, often unintentional, suicide, and lower respiratory. Then the thing that keeps us going in terms of our research and work to try and better men's health is that every one of those things seem preventable. And so we could do a lot better job of decreasing the high mortality rate of 44% of guys dying before the age of 75 in Canada. Just to say that, you know, that again, the most often told story is about men's behaviours, and to some extent it is true. If you do a sex comparison on a binary basis, you know, it does pop that men, you know, smoke more, drink more, less likely to eat vegetables, you know, and fruits. Also, they'll have some chronic illnesses in greater numbers. It sort of goes back to a lifestyle sort of piece, but I caution us to sort of be a little bit more nuanced in how we think about that too, because not all men have choices about, you know, healthy lifestyles. And so again, sort of trying to work with some of the social determinants of health. But just to say that's one of the ways it's expressed. You know, we've done a lot of work over the last 15 years in male suicide. It's for the longest time been 3 to 4 times the rate of female suicide. Just to say that one of the areas that we're been very focused on is around depression. Men are diagnosed at half the rate of women with depression, right? And so they suicide at 3 to 4 times the rate. Not suggesting it's the only route to suicide, but there's issues in terms of how we identify depression. We've done a lot of work on that. And the top 3 mortality or suicidality risks for men are substance use, broken relationships, being single, and depression. So, you know, it's kind of interesting how we sort of think about that in terms of getting upstream of what is the dire outcome that is male suicide in really, really poor numbers. In relation to work, you know, just trying to sort of dovetail into, you know, the conversation that's to come, you know, men's identity for the longest time has been wrapped up in work. And I think, you know, it's reasonably relative, you know, the history, you know, that men were paid more, you know, than women for doing basically the same kind of jobs is kind of interesting. It kind of set guys up in a way that they bought into that provider, protector, breadwinner role. And it's a bit of a hangover that it's still the case for a lot of young men that we speak to. They still buy into the idea of identity and that notion of providing. So 1932, the lunch upon a skyscraper, picture there, you know, no harnesses. And we've come a long way in this reenactment from the UK, I think in the early it might have been 2010, I want to say, you know, where, you know, there are harnesses and there's not the tobacco use and there's not the alcohol use on that pile. Again, you know, we've come a long way in some ways, but also there's this kind of this reach in terms of masculinity, in terms of guys, in terms of what they want from work and their identity being constructed around it, which I just think is worthwhile. I would not want to belabor COVID ever, but just to say, I think it sort of changed the way we think about work. You know, it kind of pushed us out of the traditional spaces of work. And we polled a bunch of guys from Canada to see how they were tracking in terms of, you know, what we think is really the perfect storm. There were financial challenges, there were distressed relationships, there was job insecurity, and there was social isolation. And I think sometimes when you're coming out of a transition, which was the transition into COVID and coming out of it, I think it's forever changed the workplace. And I think we need to pay attention to that in terms of how we think about guys and how they relate to work and their work practices and the pressure on the domestic sphere that goes with some of that. A long time ago, like an old paper, this one, but it still holds. It's quite interesting, you know, in terms of, you know, the biggest workers' compensation issues are around men's mental health. And it still holds and in fact is increasing. So again, it's an interesting one. A lot of workplaces that we speak to, they'll maybe employ us to do a seminar once a year. They'll have a discrete budget line. They might come back to us a second time, you know, a couple of years later. I think, you know, what we learnt from doing this work is like a review of what's out there, is that there's probably some room to do health promotion in the workplace in a more structured way and a more consistent way. And I'll talk about a couple of examples of that. Just to say, you know, our research, we talk to guys a lot about, you know, depressive symptoms, anxiety, And the things that pop every time for us are injury, interiority, and isolation. So we give guys cameras, ask them to take photographs of their experiences. So this from a young guy in terms of injury, the quote goes with his picture, and he's talking about being abandoned, and he's referencing his mother and father divorcing, and neither one expressing an interest in having him live with them. And then he's got his own fractured relationship where he's lost his partnership with his girlfriend of a couple of years. Again, a lot of the times with guys, injuries get washed away, tends to be normalized and tends to be like something that you should be able to organize yourself and deal with yourself. And that's where we get into the interiority. And this is a lovely quote from a guy who just is literally saying, if you know the combination, if you can work with the combination, and you'll get out of the depression and the suicide, and you want and that combination to unlock. Just a lovely metaphor in terms of guys look internally. Oftentimes they'll use substances to blunt and get a little bit of respite from the pain that they're dealing with. And we see it time and again. And this one always strikes me, a guy driving home from work in terms of isolation. He works in an open office, there's 100 strong, so he's surrounded by people, but he's on his way home and literally talks about the darkness and going home to an empty apartment and being by himself. So again, those three eyes, we often see that with guys. I think there's an intervention or a moment in each of those eyes where we can make a difference in the workplace, but also as friends and family of guys. The paper there is the long version. Just a couple of other points I'd just make to try and set this up a little is just to say, we often talk about guys not seeking help or delaying help seeking. The cardinal sign that brings guys into formal help care is pain and dysfunction. So, a lot of times they'll wait because the symptoms are actually kind of benign or not necessarily, triggering them to need help or think that they need help. That's the most often told story. What doesn't get talked about quite so much is up to 60% of the men who suicide in Canada, for example, have been in healthcare in the last 12 months. So again, it's not as simple as guys asking for help. A lot of times it's about the complexities in which they show up in clinical practice and how we see them and how we don't see them in terms of the questions that we might ask. And I think the workplace is a great spot for being able to understand guys' lives a little bit more outside of what a presenting problem might be. I'll share a couple of examples with you. We've done work with veterans over many years at UBC, the Veterans Transition Network, and it's a really lovely program. It's counselling psychology. We'd never call it that, but we call it just dropping your baggage. So bringing veterans into the space as they're reacclimatising to civilian life. So this transition out of work, into a different type of work and life. They do a lovely job of talking in the language that the guys understand, and they appeal to the camaraderie that goes with military men to sort of build an allegiance and some work, professionally facilitated, but does a really good job. I'm aware there's a bunch of folks from the trades on today. This is an example, Mates in Constructions. From Australia, it's done really well. I would just say that it's been a cultural move. So it's within the culture of construction, skilled workers trying to get conversations that we might not ordinarily get. So to break the taboo and the stigma around mental health challenges and to engage. And there are examples too in Canada. The Forge is a group that we've been looking at too over in Victoria, done a good job in terms of guys who have established mental health challenges and maybe have had previous substance use issues that are working in the trades and also construction. So there's some good programs around in that way. It would be remiss of me not to mention that within the broad category of men, the social determinants of health absolutely show us time and again that specific groups or subgroups of men are disproportionately affected by all of the issues that I've spoken about. They die younger, they have a harder time connecting with services. So again, all listed there, but I think, in terms of diversity in the workplace, we often see, folks from a whole bunch of different backgrounds that might help us sort of better understand some of the behaviours and challenges. I just close with just inviting you to the report launch. It's super important. The idea is that we're lobbying government to get a men's health framework in Canada, long overdue. The UK has one. Australia has one, lots of countries have one. We really do need something. Really encourage you, if you're kind of Vancouver based or can get to Vancouver, to join us on the 22nd of July. There are the details there. And also just the photos I shared, we use Photo Voice all the time. We ask guys to take photographs and interview them in and around it. We've got an exhibition of 8 projects from across the world that demonstrate men's mental health resiliencies. And that's the opening night is July 24th. We'd love to invite you to that as well, as an opportunity to come into a space and get a conversation about the things, the strength-based things that men do. So thanks so much, Charlotte.
Awesome. Thanks so much, John. That really lays, just such a strong foundation for our conversation. So now let's shift gears to focus on the how. So how can we actively create workplaces where men's mental health is supported? So this first question is for Casey, and John was kind of touching on language there, like how we talk about mental health and how that can impact the likelihood of men to reach out for help and things. So yeah, we know that expectations around masculinity, like that men are always supposed to be self-reliant and able to solve their problems alone, often prevent men from reaching out for help. So Casey, in your experience, what kind of language or framing helps men see mental health as something that's strengths-based rather than like weakness-based?
Sure, thank you. I think it's important first to say that I'm not a man, which might be obvious to some people, but I'm not here to speak for men. I'm here to kind of use my experience of working with men. So just want to make that very clear, because I know that there are sometimes some discrepancies around certain groups speaking for other groups. So this definitely is not what that's about. But I think that what I will do is really speak to the power of language. Anyone who knows me or has worked with me before, I'm an absolute language geek, and I'm really obsessed with really making sure that we're so responsible around our use of language. And I think that this particular question really illustrates like the power of language, right? And how when we frame things in certain ways, it can really kind of change situations, change the way that people feel, but also kind of change the way in which they might be able to access something. At Beyond Equality, obviously, we have certain sessions that we run, and they are titled in various different ways. And kind of a funny story, but clients can often ask us if they can change the title of the session, because they're like, I'm not really sure if someone's going to like that so much. Usually it's anything that has the word harassment in it, which potentially for obvious reasons kind of stands out as something that people might want to change. But interestingly enough, we did have someone once ask if we could take the word masculinity out of it, because it might put people off, right? I.e. men. And I thought that was just a really interesting insight into like a term like masculinity of itself, which fundamentally isn't doing anything or saying anything wrong, but really demonstrates the impact that like language is having on the way in which people even begin to consider opening up some of these conversations, or how they may approach it or not. I think that one of the core things for me around language is that it just doesn't sit in isolation, right? There's a historical legacy there. There are societal influences. There is a peer influence that sits at the center of this as well. And those things have been happening for years and years. And those are the things that genuinely present the real barriers for change. I think that if we could sort of look at this in terms of like a practical way, or some of the things that you can actively do when thinking about the language you use, is just speak to the reality where possible, right? Speak to the fact that this isn't just a problem with the person because there's a certain word that they don't like, or there's a certain thing that puts them off. Actually frame for them that this is something that's been going on for decades, if not centuries, that has led to this point of us also feeling really uncomfortable or difficult or quote unquote weak around a certain topic. And so speak to that reality, tell the truth, open up those conversations, really make sure that the stigma that we're seeing around well-being and care affects everybody, but particularly for men in the context of the workplace when it comes to them getting help and support. I think also I want to mention that I think we can't really just rely on a system that is based on people reaching out, right? I think we can see that that isn't working, that the idea of saying, if you need help, just go and ask for it, or like go and talk to your mate, right? All of those things are said with great intention, but there's not a lot of evidence, or not even just of like anecdotal stories that we can see where that's actually happening. And so I think it's really important that there needs to be reflection places where people can start to understand this negative messaging and these stereotypes and these norms and these gendered ideas of how we should be and how we should behave, and understand that there's some ways that we can think about what happens when maybe some of that negative messaging arrives. It isn't just the case of like, stand up and put your hand up when you need help. So another thing that I think is kind of what I want to frame as like a practical tip is, if you're having some of these conversations with people trying to kind of broach this topic, ask for people's feelings as well as their thoughts, right? When we're in a workplace, it's very often that we're used to, what do you think about this? What should we do? How should we do it? Right? We're very rarely asked like, how does this make you feel? And so that can often just be something that we're not very well practiced in. And if you expect somebody to then do that and then go and ask for support for their mental health, that's like a huge part of their learning journey that you're expecting them to cover in a really short amount of time. And so I think it's really important to kind of say maybe 2 questions, as in, you know, how does this make me feel? And then who does that benefit? Right? Really kind of doing that deep reflective work as an individual, but what are the ways that you could maybe do that in a group setting or with a colleague, just so you can start to kind of unpack like where some of these genuine feelings are coming from that are going to be impacting your behaviors, but ultimately going to be impacting your health as well. Absolute bonus points if there are any employers on the call or listening later, and that you do the work to set that up for your staff. Don't just leave it for people to work out for themselves. I think there's a huge responsibility on employers to create safe and caring and supportive and realistic workplaces for their employees. And so what it means to do that for your staff is absolutely key. So again, maybe an action around this to take away from this kind of question is this kind of conversation, I suppose, around like what it means to talk about framing mental health. This idea is like, does it make me strong? Does it make me weak? And one of the things that I think is you can maybe ask as an individual or ask with your friends, if you're asking for mental health support, does that make you strong? Does it make you weak? Or actually, does it just make you human? And does it make you realize that you're part of a huge system where life is just really difficult sometimes, and it's okay to feel that way, and that we all need help? And we all need support, and we all need friends and colleagues and people around us, because we're built to thrive when we're together. So yeah, that's my monologue-y type response to your question.
Awesome. We love a monologue. And yeah, I think like something I'm taking away from that is just how important it is to actually slow down and take the time to really lead with curiosity and understand how these conversations might be making the men in your organization feel, instead of just kind of like assuming how it's being received. So yeah, really appreciate that, Casey. Awesome. So Trevor, I'm coming to you next. And this question really actually builds on what we've just been talking about with Casey. So in workplaces where there might be a lot of stigma or discomfort, making men's mental health a difficult topic, what's like maybe a first step that somebody can take to start building meaningful support for men's mental health in their workplace?
We're on site every day having conversations with men in the workplace, and one of the challenges that we have is people are looking to policy to respond to what people are actually feeling on the day-to-day in the one-on-one level, and that's not always going to be the right response. And so the first thing that anybody at any level in the organization can start to do to challenge the stigma and to start to navigate, to overcome that within the culture is just start talking about it. But it doesn't just have to talk about it sort of expressing your own vulnerability, which obviously is incredibly important, but it's also talking about investing in your mental health and wellness, how it helps you do a better job, how navigating these conversations and showcasing your vulnerability and opening you up on that helps you make you a better leader within the organization. It makes you a better partner. It makes you a better parent. It makes you a better colleague to be able to support other people. Talking about how it helps you manage challenges in your role. It navigates resilience. A lot of people around mental health, I work in a lot of sectors where there's turnaround, there's specific missions, there's really, really difficult times of the year. You're not going to change the nature of the industry. You're not going to change the nature of the business in your individual role. And so the challenge with mental health and that is a lot of people suffer alone and they sort of pull back because that is just the cost of doing business in that space. And so the more people who start talking about just what the reaction is and how they're handling it and what that looks like and what that feels like to them is incredibly powerful in terms of how that impacts the culture. And then in there, then we can start talking about what that looks like in terms of what do you need as a support in that. I think a bit of like a side rant on my thoughts. I think we've done a really, really good job of slowly starting to erode the stigma around talking about mental health. Great. I think there's been national campaigns that tossed a hashtag every winter that have got us talking about it and disclosing what our mental health is, or people going on social media and disclosing, talking about that a little bit more. Where I think we've really failed and not stepped up to the plate as individuals, as organizations, and then also just socially at large, is we haven't had the conversation around how we hold that conversation as other people. When someone talks about their mental health, how do you respond? How do you engage? How do you support? How are you being an ally in terms of building the policy around that? And so if we're really interested in breaking down the stigma and how people access it and talk about it, then we really need to start leaning into more how we collectively are going to hold the space for people who start to disclose and start to share. You're not expected to be a therapist or mental health expert in that moment. It's more about how do you create this community, wherever your community is, whether it be your workplace, your team, the company writ large, or outside work or whatever. How do you create that community where it's more talked about, it's more engaged in that way? How do you create a community where vulnerability is part of that communication? As if it's with you in an organization, how you proactively pulse checking with people, thinking of people as individuals in that space. And then how do we share and receive stories? And that sounds like super practitioner in terms of what that actually means. And I'll try to break away from that. It's not really my vibe normally in terms of how we talk about this, but like, how do you actually, one, share your story in a really meaningful way that other people can hear and understand your vulnerability, your challenges, but then also how are we ready to receive somebody else's story too? How are we practicing? And this is something within the workplace, I think, does not just come naturally. I think a lot of us need to practice this. We either need training or we actually need opportunities to role play it and practice a bit more. Is how are we receiving people's stories? How are we reacting to that? How do we hold the space? How are we practicing having difficult, uncomfortable, vulnerable conversations, and what is our response in that? And I think a lot of us in that time thinks that like when someone says something to us, that we need to have this like really deep, unbelievable response to, and we need to know all the training, we need to know all these different things, and instead it could just be like, wow, right? Just seeing and validating someone else's experience in terms of helping in that, other people see and witness that as well. So I think when this all boils back down to really what we need in this space is we need to just start talking about it more and the realities of it more, and not in a performative sense around so-and-so has mental health, but really what does that mean and how does that show up in your day-to-day role? And then it's really an exercise of how do individuals, teams, companies, leaders particularly build trust so that people can feel that they can share their story and they can start talking about it a little bit more. And that's a challenge, because trust really is about living your values every single day. And if you're not leaning into living your values every single day, you're not building trust. You're not creating an environment where you can actually start to showcase some vulnerability, and you're not building an environment where you can start to engage and support and build policy. So.
Awesome. Thanks, Trev. And yeah, I think it's such a good point. Like, it is one thing to be able to raise the topic and raise the conversation, but then actually feeling confident in how you hold that conversation and navigate it forward from there is another thing. And it can feel uncomfortable, and challenging when somebody discloses, mental health challenges to you, but it's just about getting some practice in, some training, and there are great tools out there to practice those conversations, which I will be sending out in the handout afterwards. Go ahead, Trev.
So really quick thing. I was in a workplace and specifically had this conversation with someone where someone talked about being like, wow, I'm really struggling with my mental health. And everyone around the table, the leadership said, thank you for sharing that. On to the next item. And they didn't say, thank you for sharing that. And then as a boss, someone went out and say, okay, well, how do I manage someone with this X experience? How as a team are we changing our communication? How are we, like, what is the right environment to respond to someone doing that? And so that person felt safe enough to share. And traditionally, everyone, that would be the moment, being like, thank you for sharing, we did it, we're breaking stigma. But really where the actual work actually happens is, what are you taking with that? How are you responding? What work are you doing to create the environment? Because then what ends up happening, everybody else around that table is watching. And they'll see how it's responded, they'll see how it's dealt with, they'll see that trust is really there. And so that's where the work does about like really signal boosting, breaking down the stigma in the environment.
Awesome. Thanks, Trev. So Casey, we're coming back to you now. And for this question, I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on workplace policy and resources. Like, we know policy isn't everything. We know culture is massively important. But policy and structural support can also support culture change. So what structural changes, policies, or resources are needed to support a culture of care for men at work?
Yeah, thank you. The easy answer to this is all of them and everything, right? Like whatever it is that you can do and that you have the tools and the money for, you should be doing it, right? Like making a list of what is missing here. What skills are we missing? What people are we missing? What policies are we missing? What language is missing here? Who can't access this? Asking all of those key critical questions in order to create that culture of care. I think that some of the points that Trevor mentioned before around like trust are really important. Like trust does absolutely not come overnight. And there have been some very, very difficult moments in the past 5 years. And trust is not something that feels at the top of people's agendas right now when it comes to their workplaces because of the way things have been cut and way jobs have gone. And so that's really, really key too, that these things aren't seen as superficial or aren't seen as tokenistic or aren't just this kind of like tick boxy way of doing it. On the point of kind of policies, which I'm not a policy person, I don't do that job specifically, right? So I'm not going to talk a bunch of rubbish because who wants to listen to that? But I think the idea for me around policies, though, is that even if tomorrow your organization was to introduce a policy that said this has to happen or this shouldn't happen anymore, that's not going to necessarily change people's behavior, right? You know, even if the government of the UK makes it illegal to be sexist tomorrow with 50 years imprisonment, that's not going to change the way that people think, right? Like some people's behaviors might shift, but we're talking about deeply rooted ideologies, deeply rooted ways of thinking. And so I think seeing a policy as kind of like a solution to this actually isn't the case, but it's actually part of all of the other things that you should be doing. How are we shifting that culture? How are we building trust? How are we creating those spaces? And I think that that starts with resources. So you kind of list it as structural changes, policies, resources. I think I almost see it in the opposite way. Like we start with resources, right? Like we start with how can we create resources for people? Resources can look like documents. Resources can look like workshops. Resources can look like actually having time and space just to have a chat, right? Those are some of the things, if you start to resource your people, giving them the tools to do some of this work themselves and demonstrate that they're supported, means that when you start to introduce a policy that maybe has some of these things in place, there's already a culture shift that's happening that's going to respond better to it and understand the language and understand the purpose of why it's there. And then from that, you're going to start to see some of that structural change. So I think that's kind of the order in the way that I see it. I think that institutions probably need to ask themselves in terms of what they're doing. Like, are you doing what I like to term the bare minimum, right? Is this just a compliance piece for you? Is this just like I don't want to get sued? Or are you actually like, no, we care about our staff and we want to do something for them and we want to see the culture shift here and we want men and everyone to do well in this organization. And so really asking those questions, because those are tough ones and they sometimes seem like the simplest, but they're the big ones that we are still stuck behind even today, even when we can have so much more open dialogue around this. I think Trevor mentioned this as well. Talk. I mean, I don't know how to say it more times. Talk. Communication. Sometimes people say, what's your job? And I'm like, I just talk to people, you know, it's just my job to then ask them how they talk to people. And then they talk to other people about how they talk to people. We talk every day. And that obviously, you know, makes me sound silly saying it 15 times in a row. But we're not always skilled at having the conversations that we need to have. We're not always skilled at having, you know, interrogative questions or critical questions, or even just listening when somebody talks, right? Like, what does it mean to listen with intent? What does it mean to listen to understand rather than to respond, right? Like, I'm chatty Cathy from morning till night. And so I sometimes have to remember, sometimes I just need to listen to someone and then say, okay, I hear you, versus let me tell you this story about when this thing happened to me and then right? Like, it's so easy to do those things. So I think about really practicing some of those core skills around what it means to talk openly and authentically, which might take years, right? I don't think that there's a silver bullet in any of this. And if there is, can someone DM me what it is? Because I want to know. But what it means to kind of have the practical view of seeing that you have to be patient with yourself and that this is going to be a process, or patient with other people around you, and what it means to check in on people, not just once, not just twice, but consistently still being there for them. Like, that doesn't fit in an Instagram square and make us feel warm and bubbly about it, right? Like, it's hard work, but I think it's really important work to do. So yeah, I think kind of going back to the piece around like that kind of structural change and the resources, the one thing that I can definitely say from the experience that I have at Beyond Equality is that structural support in the form of workshops and training, when it's funded, fully funded by an organization, when people can see that, when they understand it, when they listen to senior leadership talk about how important it is, when it's celebrated, it's changed men's lives, right? Like actually changed men's lives. And there have been situations where I've been in those workshops myself. There's situations where I've been in feedback meetings where people have described working with their colleagues that now feel like they're working with their brothers because they've been able to open and connect to them, where people have been quite literally like in a situation that is not great with their spouse and being like, I just talked to them and listened to them in a different way, and that's just changed my home life now. One particular one that always stands out to me is a guy was talking about how his daughter had said that she liked him now, and then he sort of framed it as in the sense of like, I didn't really know she didn't really like me, so it was quite hard to deal with. But she came to me and said, well, Dad, you listen now, and you ask questions and you talk about things in like different ways, and like I just really like you. And I was probably welling up in the background, but it just felt really beautiful to kind of hear these personal stories about what it means to be provided with these spaces and with these like tools and resources in your workplace, because it's not only going to make care better for you at work, it's going to translate across every single aspect of your life. So yeah, little emotional story to end, but we love a happy ending, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, no. And I think like hearing stories of how this work has actually impacted people's lives is super impactful. And something you said there really stuck with me around like, why are we listening to people? Are we listening to try and problem solve, or are we listening to understand? And I think so often we feel like we have to solve the problem, right? Like that's our job and being told. And actually, when you are struggling with something to do with your mental health, like you're not really expecting to tell someone and for them to be able to just like fix it, right? Like if it was that easy, you probably would be able to do it. So
Yeah.
people, yeah, generally aren't looking for that, right?
No, I think particularly again, and I apologize if it just feel like stereotyping. I'm talking from my lived experience, but in my lived experience of being around men, they're often kind of geared to problem solve, right? All the time. Like there's something going on, you need to fix it, whether it's a parent or like my dad or a partner. I'll say something, they're like, whoa, you should do this. And have you thought about that? And I was like, can you just feel sorry for me? Can you just be like, oh my gosh, Casey, your life is so hard. You did a really good job, you know? And like, what does it mean just to be validating and just listen to that person? Because sometimes we're so wired to find solutions for people when all they just want is like an ear and some compassion. And so I think if I have had that experience, I can only imagine what that feels like for men with other men in those other situations too. So yeah, really thinking about that. What are we listening to someone for? And what do they actually want from me? Or even explicitly asking, right? You know, do you want a solution right now? Or do you just want someone to hear what you're saying? You know, actually putting those options on the table, I think can be a really helpful tip to kind of think about in those situations too. So yeah, thank you.
Awesome. Yeah, love it. Thank you, Casey. Okay, great. So Trevor, we'll come back to you. And just a reminder to everybody, drop your questions that you're coming up into the Q&A box. Should be on the bottom bar of your Zoom. And yeah, we'll try and get to as many of them as possible. And just to make it clear, John will be joining us again for the Q&A. So if you're, have questions for John about the research or anything, then bear that in mind. Okay, so Trevor, so we've talked a bit about policy and things, but beyond policy, what kind of practical steps can leaders take to actually cultivate those workplace cultures where men genuinely feel safe discussing mental health without any fear of judgment or professional consequences?
So I think there's a lot of things. That the easiest one, and let's not like cloud the field with like 16 different things, and then people leave the call being like, I'm not going to do any of them. I think the best one is to showcase your own vulnerability. And that doesn't mean, I mean, you can go in and like talk about your third divorce every day and do all that. Like if that's genuine, you go up. But like really, it just means like, are you creating an intentional space where people can open up? Where you're talking about your challenges, things are going well or not going well, and people can actually go into that. And as Casey mentioned, like this vibe of like my door is always open is really nice, that like leaders feel good saying that. That's the culture of their crew, but it's not really building genuine safety and inclusion in the environment. Because I think we know, particularly in male dominant spaces, that men feel isolated. They put the pressure on themselves. They don't turn to anyone else. They feel that this challenge, and they look for other people to help lead them out of it. And if the door is always open, is not proactively engaging people in that space. So like that showcasing the vulnerability is really important. And if we think about it from a number side, we know roughly about a third of men feel that their promotions, their projects, their career progression would be at risk if they talked about their mental health within their organization. And roughly around a third of men would also feel that the career would be over if they talked about their mental health in the workplace. And so that's not just a stat. Frankly, I think that would actually be even higher in specific male dominant industries and sectors as well, from just like the men I'm talking to that. And so companies are putting a tremendous amount of money and effort into their policies. They're putting a lot of them have incredibly strong EAPs, employee assistance programs. A lot of them have different ERGs, employee resource groups who are working on this space. But the bottom line is policy is not culture, people are culture. And so there's a gap there. And so the leader's job is to showcase your own vulnerability to help build that up. And I just wanted to sort of reference a different sort of takes on this. I was on site at a very remote work site, and I had finished talking for the day. So I was at a bar and I had a drink and I was watching the Blue Jays game. And there's someone from the company that was sitting up beside me, and he was sort of hammering a bunch of wines. And we got talking. He was chatting about just like how difficult work was feeling for him and how heavy it was, because one of his colleagues at work was an alcoholic, and you had to blow a breathalyzer to enter the site, work site in the morning. And he knew his buddy was not going to be able to enter the site. He's an alcoholic, and he knew that wasn't going to happen. So he was picking up his friend and driving him on site every single week. So obviously there's the physical safety issues with that in terms of someone showing up not sober on site and what that does. But this guy was feeling there's not only the person who's dealing with addiction and is really, really heavy in that weight. His friend, who was trying to pick up the slack and cover and all that, was also now self-medicating at a bar in response to that, because he was feeling the weight of, if this guy gets fired or let go, the money going back home that's supporting his family, this and all that, like there's a lot of what will that do to his career, all these different things. And so we don't necessarily think about the ripple effects that's caused. And the reason I bring this story up is because this company had one of the most progressive, one of the best policies that existed that I've ever seen on the books, that would pay for your rehab. It would hold your job at steady. It would not impact future career progression and your career track. It was gold standard in terms of employee engagement. But you now had several people who were trying to bypass that because the cultural vulnerability did not exist within that organization. And so the role of the leader there is, how do you showcase your own vulnerability so other people are going to lean in? How are you pulse checking people individually, not just as a team around, specifically to find out where they're at? How you, again, as I mentioned before, building that collective trust. Again, people will take risks within their mental health in terms of disclosing, in terms of leaning in, but people will take risks if they trust the process and they know how their vulnerability will be held and managed. So if you are really crystal clear as a leader about building that trust and how you want to engage people and what that looks like, people will take the risk because they trust that process of engaging with you. And the one last thing I'd sort of share that sort of arcs it back, and it's a flip side of how people can be proactive about this, leaders. And it's my own story, is I was at an organization where the boss at the time would collectively gather people together, and we'd have these like team meetings just to talk about where we were at mentally. And I remember the first time going to it being like, this is ridiculous. This is silly. Like, I'm not interested in this. I should be at my desk. I have other things going on. This just seems like a bit of like a wax of poetic type stuff. And I remember people go around and sort of share where their vibe is, where their heads are at. And it gets to me and like, I'm fine, yada, yada, and then go around. First meeting done. The leader held a second meeting about like a month or 2 months later. Same thing, people go around. I remember, this is just silly, hearing other people talk about like, well, their stress and some family things and things like that around the table. And then the third month of going to that meeting, after that leader created that space, it got to me, and I remember thinking like, hey, I don't have anything on my plate right now. Like, I don't have any projects due. I don't have anything that's really intense, but I'm not sleeping. I'm feeling really uneasy, blah, 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 blah. And it wasn't until that third time that it led to me sort of unpacking some things and discovering that I undiagnosed anxiety disorder. And if that leader didn't intentionally create that space of vulnerability, and it wasn't once, it wasn't twice, it was the third time where I finally felt safe enough to lead in. And so it was a commitment in making that intentional space of pulse checking people, creating a space where I trusted the process of how that vulnerability was going to be handled and where it was going to go. So I was ready to take that risk of leaning in, that led me to going on and figuring out what that looks like for me. And it was a radical shift, not only just in terms of my professional and personal life, but the next step of that wasn't just like, okay, cool, Trevor, that happened for you. It was my senior partner in the office who was the one who was managed me directly. They spent the time to go out and say, how do I work with someone with anxiety disorder? What are some of the best ways for me to engage? How does that look? And they did the work to figure out how to engage with me the best. So sometimes it wasn't sending long emails, it was sending a voice note that was easier for me to do and less stressful. Sometimes just how we meet. It was small tweaks because they wanted to put in the work to understand my unique participation in the space. So as leaders, boiling this all back down to is like we take physical safety and how we engage, and we proactively do it, right? We'll tell someone to take physical leave because they busted their knee, and we recognize what that looks like, but we don't really put the same side on that mental health and wellness side in terms of what we're looking at and proactively engaging people to lean into that space. So the job of the leader really is to create the space where people can actually start to lean in a little bit more.
Awesome. I love that, Trev. Yeah. And I think like the comment about trusting the process and actually taking the time to build the trust is just like, I don't know, it's the same in our personal lives, right? Like you probably wouldn't disclose mental health issues you were having to somebody you knew but didn't know very well or didn't trust. Like it takes time to build those relationships where you're like, okay, this is a safe person. I know them and I know that they're gonna hold the space for what I want to talk about. And yeah, that it's going to be a positive conversation. So I appreciate that. Awesome. Okay, so Casey, coming back to you. So we know that there are some challenging things going on in the world right now around DEI, and DEI is, you know, facing some resistance. And I think in times like this, it can feel necessary to kind of double down on supporting, you know, women, gender diverse people, and others who we, you know, perceive to generally face more workplace barriers than men, right? So how can we prioritize men's mental health at work without seemingly taking away from support for other groups? And how might we respond to concerns that doing so detracts from other equity efforts?
Big question.
Big question. Big one.
$1 million question. Actually, let me say $1 billion, because in this economy, million's not going to get you very far anymore. I feel like I have a lot to say about this question, and I think it is also like it's quite a complex question too, because there are so many layers to it. And when I read it for the first time, I was like, oh no, I'm gonna need like 25 minutes of this one, not 7, because there are people's feelings are involved in this, right? And I say this as someone who like is on the front line of doing DEI work with organizations, working for an organization that talks about men's mental health and well-being, and people are upset, right? Like prioritizing men's mental health in a world where for a lot of people you're like, but men get everything. Like the world's made for them. Like this is easy. What are you talking about? That does not mean that what they're saying is true, but it does mean that that's how they feel, all right? Or they have maybe been made to feel through their experiences. And so I think that this is actually a really, really big challenge, because managing the communications and managing the conversations around what it means to see an uptake in this conversation in a lot of ways. And probably for some people and organizations actually have had to experience money being taken from one part and put into another, right? Or seeing someone talk about something and then no longer talk about something else. And so those are really real experiences that sit there. And I think that, I mean, I questioned kind of back and forth if this is part of a DEI backlash, which again, I would always argue I've been doing this work for a really, really long time. And I think the backlash has always been there, right? My kind of go-to point is as soon as someone said, hey, I don't want to be oppressed anymore, someone was like, I don't think so, you know, right? Like, we're just going to carry on because this is doing okay for us. So there's always been this resistance as communities, as groups of people, as people at different levels of society that don't represent that 1%. We have always been fighting back to get what's been taken from us, right? And so I think that that's a key thing to acknowledge as well. And so I think that this will always be a difficult thing to do, right? The thing being, how do we prioritize men's mental health without taking things away from other people? Because I actually can't give you an answer to that if I don't know what an organization is going to actually do about that, right? Like, are they actually going to roll back something else? Are they actually going to take funds away or resources or time away? Or is the narrative going to shift so much that if other people feel like that their issues are being sidelined? And I think a lot of this is wrapped up with wider conversations around privilege as well, which privilege is an extraordinarily important conversation to have around the conversations around men's mental health. And that's not to frame this as that men are only wholly privileged, but the privileges still sit there regardless of what your experiences might be. And so I think that that's an important thing that I often see organizations maybe don't take the time to do, because we can often, in that sort of DEI sense, I suppose, put things in boxes, right? Like we love to have things in really neat tick box things, like, okay, we did the Women's Month thing. Okay, we did the LGBTQ History Month thing. Okay, we did Black History Month thing. We did all of those things in all these boxes. And therefore that kind of puts us in silos, and it also doesn't make any space for like the ways in which our identities intersect and the ways in which that, particularly when we put things in boxes, people always get left out as well. And so I think for me, which again doesn't seem like a clear answer, because I just don't think that there is one, because I think the context and the circumstances around it is that if you are going to, let's say, quote unquote, prioritize men's mental health, what capacity and how committed are you to explaining to people that in doing that, it doesn't have to be one thing that takes away from another? Like two things can be true at once, two things can happen at once, or more than that, right? And so I think sometimes often the work isn't being done on that sort of more human level, on that interpersonal level, to explain and demonstrate to people that just because something's being added to an agenda or something's being shifted up a ladder as an agenda, that they're going to forget everything else. Because there isn't a way in which I think it's helpful to kind of hierarchize people's suffering, right? Like sort of oppression Olympics, as I kind of call it, right? That just creates very messy conversations and it makes everybody very upset. And that is essentially the opposite of what we want to achieve in those moments. So I think that if we're going to respond to those concerns, we respond to them as concerns. I hear your concern. I understand why that's frustrating for you. I can see why you might think that because we're now doing this, we're no longer doing that, right? Validate what people are feeling, and then also do that introspective work to make sure that what you are doing, there's some sort of narrative behind it, logic behind it, or even if there is, actually a really cutthroat decision that you've had to make around this year, we're just going to fund this piece of work, explain why. And I know that I say that and I want to take it back already, because honesty is very expensive in a corporation, and I know that too. And there can be a lot of collateral damage when you do tell the truth. But I do think that people want to hear it, and they want to be talked to in a way that doesn't condescend their own feelings. And so I would hope that in a perfect situation or in a perfect world, we can prioritize men's mental health. We can talk about women's rights. We can talk about everybody else's rights and visibilities and needs for equity in the best way possible. But I think it's also key to reflect that we're probably never going to get that perfectly right, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a solution that we look for. It can just be a genuine response that we can find. So I think that would be my main thing, is really seeing that these concerns are very real in a world that is very unbalanced. Asking people for grace and patience around men's lives is a big ask in a lot of situations, right? What it means to also hold space for other people is also an astronomical piece of work that be very, very, very difficult for certain people. So I don't think that we can ask for patience and grace from people if we haven't educated and informed them and been transparent about this work. I think that people deserve answers, and people need to understand how these frameworks work. And I think that there's an institutional responsibility to provide them.
Love that. And you're right. I mean, like it's not a zero-sum game. There is enough of the pie to kind of go around for everyone. And also all of these challenges that we're facing are so interconnected, right? If we're supporting people, it's going to have positive impacts on other groups of people. And I think like one thing I'm really taking away from what you said is just like lead with empathy, you know, and yeah, go into those conversations from a place of curiosity. And again, it's coming back to listening to understand, right? Instead of trying to solve the problem, and just validate what people are feeling. Awesome.
Definitely. Thank you.
Cool. All right, so Trevor, I'm coming back to you, and this is our final question before the Q&A. So another reminder to get your questions into the box as they're coming up. So Trev, I'm sure that there are probably people on the call who are thinking, I've tried to develop initiatives to support the mental health of men in my organization, but they don't come, they don't show up. So what advice would you give to anyone who's in that position and thinking like, how do I get the men in my workplace to engage with this new initiative?
So the number one demographic that brings us in to talk about men's mental health in workplaces are the women. The groups who consistently are the ones who are spending their limited budget, they're working with their really limited capacity, are women's ERGs, are other groups within the workplace. And so I know there's a care there for doing that, and it's frustrating when men don't show up. I think men do care though. I think what we're not doing is properly navigating and accessing and sort of rolling with the barriers that are maybe preventing them from being there. And I think when I talk with men in the workplace, no matter, and this is beyond just how do we change a title? It's because that's a very real thing too, in terms of like, I was in a session yesterday and the guy came up at the end of the session and he was like, I thought this was going to be feminism. And it was about men's mental health. And so like the title play is a real thing, but here's some of the main ones that we get is a lot of men feel, particularly in more male dominant workspaces, that men's mental health, self-care, all that type of stuff is really selfish, that they have a job to do to provide for the family. It is a luxury to think about their own mental health and their own care in that sense. And so that's one vibe. Another is a lot of people say like, this is really nice, I really care about it, but I'm just too busy right now. This doesn't factor into what I am doing in my day-to-day, and it'd be really, really cool. And I think that goes for a lot of the conversation around allyship work too, not just men's mental health. There's a conversation around people thinking that this is really important, but there may be layoffs, there may be other challenges, and I don't want to single myself out, or I don't want to divert from what I'm supposed to be doing right now and give anyone a reason to sort of look my direction. And so those, among other reasons as well. And so I think there is a very real vibe with men about this preventing them, not just that like they look at it and shrug and be like, this doesn't apply to me. Because when you start to talk to men around men's mental health, and you start talking to them about suicide rates, about average living, about the opioid overdose rates, about addiction rates, when you start going down incarceration rates, homelessness rates, you start going down, and men start seeing themselves in this and being like, wow, like I actually, like this does impact me, it impacts the people that I care about and the people in my affinity as well. And so they start to really get that, but you have to get them in the room. And so I think there's a few things that we should focus on. One is it always should be strength-based. Men do not respond to the problematic language of that there is a problem that they need to be solved, or there's an aspect to them that's damaging or broken. The framing of the conversation needs to be strengths-based, not just in terms of how we get them in the room, but how we engage them in the room. We need to, let's think really operationally here, hit them with the what's in it for me. Instead of just talking about the soft stuff, you mean having a conversation and getting into the room and talking about this wellness and mental health will make you a better leader. It will help you hit bonus this year. It will help you have a more effective or higher performing team. And these metrics are all real and true. Like those aren't us just making something up to get someone in the room. Like that is actually very real. Investing in this actually does lead to those outcomes. So don't leave with like the happiness is crucial to stronger emotional relationships. Again, that is very true. That's something we say when they're in the room, but that's not going to draw them to the room because that's not germane to their core mission in terms of what they see their role is. And we know, like, obviously happiness is absolutely vital to their success physically and emotionally and mentally. And so that is absolutely true in terms of what we need to do. But I'll tell you right now, having done this work in male dominant spaces over and over again, that does not get somebody in the room. You need to draw the what's in it for me in a really very clear sense on that. And so those are some of the things to get someone drawn into the room. But here's some other things. Get some buy-in from other key people. Doesn't necessarily need to be the CEO. Obviously, that's incredible if it is in terms of what's an authentic buy-in for that. Get another key business leader within the organization. So that could be someone with some form of social capital. They could be popular, they could be super senior, they could have just any level of reverence that can sort of help lead the charge and explain why it's important to them. And I was just at an organization very recently, and the CEO was in the room and talked about their own personal mental health story and their family setup and what that was. And they explained to every male in the room, it was all men in the room, CEO explained to all of them why it was super important to him, to the company, the culture, and the success of the organization. So it wasn't just like, I care about this because this happened, I have this trauma, but it was, this is why I'm here and it's important for the company and our success. And it opened up the room. And so that was really key. And I think the other thing is when I chat with men, around this. And I poll them and say, like, how many of you guys consider yourself an ally? And like the majority of the room, the hands go up. Like, how many of you guys would want to be there for a friend or colleague who would reach out and ask for help? All the hands fly up. I mean, you flip that question and say, how many of you reach out for help? And like, no one puts up the hand, but that's another conversation. But when I ask who here wants to do something, the hands are up. So then what the call is, we need to actually make the ask. We need you at this event. We need you at this ERG. I need you to show up. I need you to invite someone. Men keep on saying that they are ready to be there. They care about this issue, but they really just need to be explicitly told, here's what specifically we need from you. And it's one of the first things I coach when we talk about gender equity in organization to men is like, show up at a women's ERG. Men don't see themselves in that work. And one of the key things is show up. They will tell you, you'll learn more, you'll figure out how you can be involved. So the key thing there is just ask men on a more relationship level, individual level, not just a blast. Start asking people, Paul, we really would love to see you at this event. I think your attendance would really be meaningful. And could you please help bring other men? John, start doing that. That's how you're going to get in, build those relationships. And the last thing I'd say on this is we have this there's this collective ability to sort of hit eject off of some of these things. So like a lot of guys will like see an event and say like, I'm not needed there specifically. That session will be fine without me. I feel honky-dory. I feel like my mental health is fine, even if we can talk about the reality of that. But I feel all of that. I don't need to be there. And the work of that session continues on in my absence. So instead, the call to action is, we specifically need you at this event. Your specific attendance matters. Your perspective is going to inform somebody else, and the session will suffer because we don't get to hear your story. Stop allowing people to hit eject because of that collective ability that things will just march on without them. We need your access to your team and your community. So make that ask to someone really specifically in that space. Those are some of the key things to get people involved. And then start small. We put these ridiculous metrics on ourselves about saying like, oh my gosh, I put out an email blast to 500 men and only 2 men showed up, and the men won't come. Well, like let's manage expectations in terms of how we're engaging. The peer-to-peer is the way you're going to go. And so we want to employ people with those side conversations. So it's not about attracting the guys who are the most resistant in the office, who are really, really struggling. And we know these need the conversation, but it's going to take a lot more attention. Start engaging the guys who are a little bit more friendly and are ready to lean in and know that they want to do something, but just don't know how. Those are the people we start with, and then they're going to start to spread the words, and you'll start to build the program. So it's really not as complicated. It's just that we need to be a lot more real in terms of the what's in it for me and start making the specific ask.
Awesome. Thanks, Trev. And I think just so helpful as well to hear some of those phrases of what you actually might say in these situations. I think it's really easy for us to talk about like, when this conversation happens, hold it in this way, but actually having examples of the kinds of things that we can be saying, like, this is why I'm here and it's important for our company and our success and things like that is really helpful. So thank you. Awesome. So we are going to move to our Q&A now, and we have a few questions in the Q&A box. And this first one, John, I'm actually gonna pose to you first, but Casey and Trev, if you want to jump in at all, please feel free to. But yeah, John, this first question is there any research that shows that not framing an initiative as a mental health initiative actually increases the chances men will engage? So I'm thinking this is probably about like, if I frame it as like a social thing or something else and don't lead with mental health, is that more effective?
Yeah, so I don't know that it's, we've got empirical evidence to definitively answer that, but I would say that in some instances, it's very, very powerful. So if you think about maybe men's sheds, it's really about gathering guys who might not have purpose or might be lacking purpose, going through transition, bereavement, divorce, retirement, and getting them socially connected. So we'd never talk about social connection. We'd never talk about loneliness necessarily, but we talk about men's sheds as a place where blokes can gather and it would be familiar and there'd be other blokes there and you'd be doing something. So just to say, I think a lot of those programs are really powerful because they provide a sense of community. And just to say, health promotion, is back. We were all up in the population public health level for a very long time. The epidemiology of the problems, we're back on the ground. It's community based now, especially post COVID. So there's a real push towards that. So there is an essence of bringing guys into a space where it's not explicitly about mental health. Like, we don't really use that language a whole lot, but bringing them into a gathering where other folks might be there for them to connect with. And activities are good. We often talk about guys, do really well shoulder to shoulder when it's not sort of direct and they're looking for yes or no answers type thing. It's more of a shoulder to shoulder where there's less pressure on the dialogue, so to speak. Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks, John. Trav, Casey, any thoughts? No pressure.
I have a quick thing. We've been doing engaging men workshops for a number of years, specifically male dominant workplaces. And if I think back to the evolution in terms of how we've framed the conversation, right? Like, as we're going through, like, these are conversations around equity focused leadership. There's conversations around inclusion in the workplace and blah, 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 blah. The one that drives the most people to attend is when we explicitly say men's mental health in a male dominant workplace and all that. And that's not just like, oh, somewhere on Bay Street in Toronto who has like a closer and wanted connection to that. When I'm up in the oil sands and an incredibly resistant audience who normally does not talk about this, when a guy hears men's mental health, they lean in. And same thing when I was presenting yesterday to a traditionally unbelievably resistant audience, which normally is a lot more friction live in scene. And they had a tremendous showing because the guys know they're not all right. And so they hear that, and there's been such a void of engaging men on men's mental health, particularly in workplace settings, for so long. When they hear that, they show up. The big part is, once they show up, are we properly carrying the torch for point 2, point 3, point 4? Because they're all watching. So if you burn that mental health conversation on your first session and don't actually have a strategy to follow up and all that, they won't follow up for 2, 3, 4. But I find that the pickup is quite big.
Awesome.
I think one thing I'll just add, which is not a huge thing, but often we will do workshops with organizations and we'll offer a men's only space and a mixed gendered space, and people can choose which they want to go into. There are various reasons for that, but I think the one of this here is that they're in those circumstances where there are people, particularly men in this case, that want to show up. They don't want to do that kind of segregated space piece, but what it does is it allows kind of for people to say, like, I'm at this point where I need to be with other men to talk about this, and I'm at this point where I can talk about this with other colleagues. And I think that is a kind of really good way to demonstrate the trajectory and the difference that you'll have between some men and where they might want to show up in that conversation. Some people are very adamant that, like, no, this should be how we do this all together, and others are very much like, I need to just be able to do this in a group with men only. What I will say also quickly about the men only spaces, is very important to communicate that to your teams if you are running men only spaces, and that to why that's important, and why that's important for the long-term work here, because otherwise you just get a bunch of incel backlash and nobody wants to deal with that. So just small tip.
Yeah, no, it's definitely a good point. And I have heard some stories about that happening, and broader teams not being kind of looped into that, and it can definitely cause some issues. But like we said, communication, transparency around all of this is just key. Awesome. So another question we had in the chat. So this one was actually in the chat first, and then in the Q&A, and it says, what about men who are very uncomfortable hearing a co-worker talk about their feelings? Some will just want to bolt. So I think it's a good question. How do we kind of navigate that if there are men in the organization who are just like, I'm very uncomfortable hearing about my coworkers' mental health? I'm gonna throw that one out broadly, but whoever wants to jump in, go ahead, Trev.
Thoughts on everything. But I think, so I hear it all the time. This is like, I'm not here to be a therapist. They get the cringe and all that. I have two thoughts on this. One is the fact that is a showcase about how unpracticed we are with really powerful, authentic conversations. And I think it shows us that particularly in those settings, we need more opportunities to practice that in a really meaningful and authentic way, so that it's not a trauma dump from everybody coming at it from every angle, but people can actually practice what's safe and authentic to them and start to recognize how to receive it. The second thing is when we go into workplaces and we get that from guys is saying like, there's a difference between someone saying like, hey, like I'm struggling today, or like, oh, today, like my energy's low, or like I'm just not feeling right, whatever. And then someone coming and talking about like the really, really intense trauma. And your response as a human, like when someone's feeling tough and all that, is not to run, like that's not running away. I understand that the knee jerk when it's something a little bit more deep and intense that you don't know how to navigate. We're not therapists. You're not, I mean, maybe you are, I don't know who's watching, but like, or a counselor, or like you're not trained medically and trained properly for that. And the expectation isn't for you to hold that space. So that one, it could be like, wow, that's tough. Wow, it sounds like you should talk to someone. Wow, like it doesn't need to be this whole like technical response. I understand the discomfort, but if we start working on just practicing that in a more authentic way of people showcasing some vulnerabilities, some people being just saying, well, it's tough and leaving, or some people like leaning in and saying, I'm really sorry, tell me more, let me direct you to something. Like find what's safe to you, but we need to start practicing like powerful, authentic conversations in the workplace and start navigating a little bit that discomfort, because that discomfort is one of the gendered barriers, particularly that is preventing men from leaning in more and accessing more support.
I love that, Trev. And sorry, go ahead, Casey.
No, you can summarize.
I was just, what you were saying was reminding me of something that we champion a lot in our work. And this was a phrase that was kind of adopted from one of our online communities we run. But the phrase is speak in draft. And it basically just means like, we don't have to always have the perfect words or know the perfect terminology or how to solve these problems, but we can do our best and kind of edit after the fact and give ourselves and each other a little bit of grace in that. And I think just even like sharing that as an idea is something that's been really impactful in our communities. So just came up for me. But Casey, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think two things that stand out for me is I think it's important to check on someone's capacity before you share as well, right? Like practicing being like, do you have capacity to listen to me right now? Because we don't know what's going on with each other behind closed doors, behind the scenes. And that's an important thing, I think, which is part of this kind of respectful, open, vulnerable conversations, is just saying, I have something I want to share. It's a difficult topic. Do you have space for me right now? Can I have 5 minutes of your time? Can I have 10, right? Like really being specific about what the ask is about and making sure that that other person has the space for it too. And then second, and it's the thing I hear all the time where people say, well, I don't know what to say if, and then they literally say the exact sentence that they should say to the person what they're talking about, right? So they say, I don't know what to say if someone wants to open up to me. I just feel like I want to run away from the conversation because I don't know how to deal with it. And I'm like, why don't you say that? Right? Be honest. Be like, this is, I'm going to listen, but this is really hard for me right now, right? Like I don't know what I'm meant to say, and I'm probably going to be a bit clunky. If someone does share something that's personal, or something around their mental health, or something that's heavy, I think it's quite okay to say, like, thank you for sharing with me. I don't know what the answer to that is. This is making me uncomfortable, but I'm going to do my best, right? I'm going to try. And if I don't get it right, I'm sorry. And I can try and come back to you, or we can touch this again. But I think it's really key in those moments is to actually be honest. And if you're struggling or finding it difficult or wanting to be like, where is the nearest black hole that I can jump into so this goes away? I mean, maybe not the black hole piece, but actually just being really honest about you're saying, I'm not a therapist. I'm not a clinical person. I'm not a coach. I'm just a person. And so I'm going to do a bit of a okay to rubbish job, but like, let's see what we can do with it. And I think that often that holds so much more than people can imagine in some of those dialogues, because that person is also way uncomfortable too, and probably really like, oh my gosh, what am I about to do? So I think there's a level of just kind of like real kind of deep human connection there to be like, should we fumble through this together and see where we get?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think it also goes back to the same thing of like resisting the urge to feel that you have to solve the problem for them. And another thing you said earlier around like checking in around what that person is actually looking for. Like, are you looking for a solution now, or are you looking for just like a bit of validation? I think it's always really nice when somebody actually just asks, like, what do you want from me right now? We can be that straightforward, and it's actually not a bad thing. I think sometimes our brains tell us that it is, but really it's the most helpful way to go about things. Awesome. So this next question, John, I'm coming back to you for this one, directed towards you. And the question is, From your research, you mentioned challenges around how we are responding to men when they do reach out for help. And I think maybe this was in your research more touching on like healthcare settings and things like that. But the question is around, are there any tools or kind of principles that people could bear in mind when they are in a position of a man disclosing mental health challenges to them? So I think that's like anything people can draw on or just kind of keep in their back pockets to do a good job of responding. And
Yeah, so a couple of things, open-ended questions sounds really basic, but why, how questions rather than are, is, because you'll get yes, no answers. So it kind of gives us permission to talk. So I think that's really, really key. I think folks have been real eloquent in how they've talked about, that notion of listening actively, not trying to solve problems. I think when we ask guys to elaborate, we can often point them in the direction of what's worked for you previously. Like you must have had stressful situations before, like what's worked for you, and just try and switch them into a space of thinking about, remedy, so to speak, without prescribing and getting into the place of solving problems. And also sometimes we drop into third person and we'll talk about a mate who did something that worked for him. Might be in relation to counselling psych, might be, some things that worked really well for somebody else who was experiencing some challenges. And I just think that the last bit is, if a guy self-discloses, you must be back in contact. You must be back in contact within 24 hours. Like, super important. And whether it's just a text to affirm the conversation is legit, appreciating the self-disclosure, but just norming that connection, I think is key. For the clinical sense, it's so interesting. We often get on clinical pathways and we'll be like trying to narrow a guy down to the problem that he's presenting with so we can prescribe the fix. And that is a lot of guys conditioning. They're like about, having a problem. Like you disclose and then you get the answer and then you go off. And I just think clinicians, I think we could all learn a lot from the open-ended questions. That the exact thing I'm talking about is like, we rarely ask about guys' relationships. We know it's the second biggest trigger for suicidality when one breaks down. Like, it's like, we just got to maybe ask some open-ended questions that kind of get into knowing that person a little bit beyond what they're presenting with or the behaviours. And just say, we see guys agitated, self-medicating with booze, and it's actually depressive symptoms, So sometimes you've got to just get below what's presenting or what you're seeing and maybe try and, work in a little bit to understand the context. So just to share out that way.
Awesome. Thanks, John. Yeah, and I love, asking open-ended questions is a great tip. And I think for those of us who are thinking, I would love some like specific things I can do, that like 24-hour check-in is just a great thing to bear in mind, because it does make a big difference. And I'm sure we've all been in those positions where we've talked to somebody about something and then you kind of leave the conversation and you're like, oh God, like, is that okay? And if that person then just sends you a check-in, like a text that can literally be, I'm just checking in to see how you're doing today. It doesn't need to be any more complex than that. It just really normalizes the conversation and also can help reduce a lot of shame, I think. Awesome. Okay, so this question is also in the Q&A box, and it says, interested in the panel's thoughts on fostering this conversation in agriculture, an environment where men often work alone, carry significant financial responsibility, and business success is often dependent upon the weather. We are losing way too many farmers to suicide. So thoughts on that one, and I'm sure a lot of this could probably be applied to some other industries as well, but yeah, who would like to jump in?
I can shout out just there's a little bit of there is some traction in Quebec, in Canada, for some programs around specifically for farmers. Hard to reach because of the very reasons that you mentioned. But access to lethal means also the isolation of the nature of their work, right? So they're real risk factors. They do a good job in Ireland, smaller country. I think it's a little bit easier to apprehend, for want of a better term, folks who are isolated in their work. And what's worked there is the agricultural governance, overarching kind of governance for farmers, has actually dipped some money in, a lot like mates in construction, to try and work with the industry to connect farmers, so to reduce that social isolation. It's called On Firm Ground. Well, that's the translation from Irish. But just to say, I think occupation-wise, they're one of the most vulnerable, for all the reasons mentioned in that question. So I think it does go back to what I would class as the commercial determinants of health that we don't talk about very often, but we should. Like, it's those industries that profit from the farming work that goes on that might also protect the workers within, within those occupations. So just a shout out on that one.
I would say there is in similar sectors, there's a lot of work within the industry associations, specifically on building the community in that space as well. Is people obviously very remote, so it's a little bit different in terms of how you build those communities by that sector. But then also creating spaces that aren't just industry to get through the association as well to build those communities. Again, so here's the challenge that this, and it's a lot of the other sectors in the same way too. We're not going to change the industry. We're not going to change. I mean, obviously, on a macro thing, we could obviously pull policy levers on a large area, but if we're talking real terms, not changing the industry, the nature of the business overnight. And so really then what can we do live in this moment that helps challenge some of these dangerous spaces while we wait for the larger macro sort of movements? And the biggest ones is leaning into the industry associations to start to creating community, support the community. They're ones who actually have the capacity to support that.
Awesome. Thanks, Trev. So we're coming up to 5-2. So I think just one kind of final question that I would love to ask all of you, and I didn't send this one ahead of time, so a little bit putting you on the spot. But the question is, if there was one thing you would want somebody in the audience to take away from today's conversation, what would it be? So I'm curious if anything is coming straight up for any of you. But yeah, one thing you would hope someone to take away from our chat today. What would that be? I'm gonna pause. I'm putting everybody on the spot, so whoever has it. Trev, go ahead.
I think there's a two-part really quickly, but I think the first thing is that, like, I think we've always thought about mental health in really, really severe terms, in terms of everything goes to the most severe. And I think there's an opportunity for us to think about it in other forms of mental illness and mental health around us as well, and what the proactive conversation around that looks like for a lot of us. And so the second part of I would hope that people take away is that the challenge and the conversation around mental health, particularly in workplaces, can be an individual response. That we don't have to sit on our hands and wait for the company to do something. We don't have to sit and wait for a program. We don't have to wait for things like that. That a lot of that individual power comes on a peer-to-peer level. And so the leadership, the showcasing, all of that is an individual. So for me, it really is about how are you displaying your own vulnerability and how are you proactively engaging other people, not just sitting back, but actually proactively having the conversation to engage and build trust.
Awesome. Thanks, Trev. Casey or John?
Yeah, I think maybe there's two things is for me is maybe similar to how kind of Trevor shaped it there, but like, are you doing preventative work or are you doing restorative work? Right. So there's a really important part of preventing this, that before we have a conversation around mental health, we need to talk about mental well-being, right? Like, what are some of those practices, some of those things that we should be doing each and every day just to make sure that our well-being's in a great place so that we hopefully don't get to those positions of having to deal with mental health. And of course, knowing that there is a whole trajectory of things that come there, but I think often there can be a bigger focus on like when you're at that point and there needs to be an intervention or things need to be very serious versus like what are some of those practices and habits that we can start to encourage one another to do that actually would hopefully contribute to your better and more positive mental health in the future. So I think really thinking about, are we doing preventative or restorative work, and why are we not doing both? If not, because both are very important.
Awesome. Thanks, Casey. John, take it away.
Yeah, just caution folks to think creatively about the idea that men's health has often been positioned as a deficit model. Don't live as long as women, don't go to the doctor. I think it's really naive. I think there's some lifestyle drift issues that we can help guys with, but the workplace is an opportunity for structural determinants of health to improve some of those and to work within the broader governances. And I'd love to keep our eye on that, you know, about what positive differences we can make. And just in terms of potential funds to help us do some of that work too. I just think commercial determinants of health, there's just so many people making money off of health. Like, you know, your Lululemons, your Adidas, you know, they're selling health. Like, it's just like, I'm like, there's got to be a way of not relying on grants where we miss 85% of the time and get up 15% of the time, you know, to bankroll some of the great community products that are out there for health promotion, just to say.
Awesome. Thanks, John. Okay, so as we close out our conversation today, I just want to extend a huge thank you to all of our panelists for sharing their expertise and their time with us today. Such an important conversation, and it's honestly been very valuable to hear from you all. And a huge thank you to you, our attendees as well. If you would like to join more conversations like this one, you can become a voicemail member. By becoming a member, you get a voicemail magazine subscription, as well as access to our online member hub, where you can join exclusive member-only events and interactive workshops with experts on topics like gender, masculinity, mental health, healthy relationships, and more, and connect with others passionate about these topics, as well as access discounts on Next Gen Men products and offerings. To find out more about membership, you can scan the QR code on your screen or go to nextgenmen.ca/support. And lastly, you can stay in touch with us on social media at Next Gen Men. In the next couple of days, you'll receive a follow-up email containing some resources, the recording of our session, contact details for our panelists as well. So thank you all for being here, for your questions, and for your commitment to making workplaces inclusive, positive, and supportive environments for everyone. We look forward to seeing you at the next voicemail talks. Bye for now.